This is the new 2022 Audi E-Tron GT, and it's the latest high-performance electric vehicle. Tesla has seen a lot of challengers lately in the performance EV world, ranging from the Porsche Taycan to the crazy Hummer EV pickup truck. And now Audi's sports sedan EV rival is here. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era. We've had some great sales recently on Cars and Bids, including this Tesla Model S P100D, which sold for $71,500, this Porsche Cayenne with a manual transmission, which sold for just over $32,000, and this Ford Raptor, which sold for $60,000, done very well with Raptors. If you're looking to sell your cool car from the 1980s and up, Cars and Bids is the place. We will get your auction listed the fastest, and we will get the most bids and the most interest in your cool car. And if you're looking to buy a cool car from the modern era, check out Cars and Bids with an amazing variety of daily auctions at carsandbids.com. So let's talk E-Tron GT. Two versions will be offered with the E-Tron GT. First goes on sale later this year. There is a base model with 522 horsepower, does 0 to 60 in around 3.9 seconds, or you can step up to this, the RS version with 637 horsepower, does 0 to 60 in about 3.1 seconds. Both come standard with all-wheel drive and they have a range of about 230 to 240 miles. Pricing will start around $100,000 for the base model, or around $140,000 for the ultra high performance RS version. If the design looks familiar, that's because you've seen it before, sort of. The E-Tron GT shares its platform with the Porsche Taycan and also some of its components. The base level E-Tron GT is roughly equivalent to the Taycan 4S, and the RS is the Taycan Turbo. But the two cars do have very different styling, very different interiors, and the Audi is a little bit cheaper by a few $1,000. And today I'm going to review it. First, I'll take you on a tour of the E-Tron GT and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a DougScore. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the E-Tron GT by discussing the styling, which I think is absolutely gorgeous. I think this is a beautiful car, one of the best looking EVs on the market yet. I think it's fantastic. Ever since Audi was first showing the original images, it was getting spy shots, I thought this was a nice looking car. In fact, I happen to think this looks a little better than the Porsche Taycan, which is going to be a bit of a controversial opinion. The Taycan is definitely more distinctive, more special, more head-turning. This is a little bit more understated, which I generally prefer in cars, but I really think this has a nice, simple, clean performance car look, and frankly, it looks good from just about every angle. With that said, one interesting design detail, on the outside of this car, obviously, it looks a bit like the A7, but sort of a more modern, in my opinion, better looking version. It has this fastback design, but unlike the A7, the E-Tron GT is not a hatchback. Instead, you can see it has a traditional trunk back here, and frankly, a relatively small trunk opening if you want to put large stuff in here, although the trunk area itself is pretty big. You can see it goes back very far, very deep, even though the opening is relatively small. But not a hatchback, a trunk, which might be surprising given the styling. Now, one interesting item worth noting in the trunk, there are a few little storage compartments that make it a little extra practical. For instance, this one over on the right is small, but surprisingly deep. You could keep a lot of stuff in there, get stuff lost or hidden if you wanted to. You also have a little underfloor storage compartment. You lift this piece up, and you have a little bit more storage space for privacy, or if you don't want it rolling around in the trunk. Now, our next interesting item back here is badging. This is the RS E-Tron GT, the high performance version, and you can see it is badged with an RS badge over on the left and E-Tron GT over on the right, and that is how Audi is referring to it as well. Not E-Tron GT RS, but rather RS E-Tron GT. Just like RS4 or RS6, the RS comes first, but you have a standalone RS RS badge over on the left, and then E-Tron GT over on the right to emphasize the order of how you read it. Now, speaking of the rear back here, some interesting items worth noting. For one thing, you have this rear light bar, which has become very common in a lot of modern vehicles, especially a lot of newer Audi models. It looks very nice, very modern, and very cool while it's on. You also have this turn signal back here, which looks very cool, although I strongly suspect this is the European model turn signal. It doesn't really conform to US regulations, but it still looks cool sweeping across the back of the car, and I dream of having such a turn signal on Audi models in the United States. Now, speaking of lighting, things also look pretty cool up front. Even just the regular running lights when they're on look very neat in this like modern light housing. They have these individual little strips of running light, and frankly, I think that just looks fantastic. It's a nice modern kind of futuristic look. It also looks cool when you have the turn signal on. Again, you can see it sweeps across the front of the car. A very beautiful look, and I hope at least that makes the US market car. It is a very, very cool design. Other interesting design features up front. One is on the front grille. Obviously no real front grille, but this place that looks like the front grille has this sort of strange, like elevated hexagon design that looks interesting and unusual and certainly noteworthy as a small quirk. Now, interestingly, that can also be painted body color depending on the model you get. Here's the regular E-Tron, not the RS, and it's this blue color. And again, the elevated hexagons in the front. I think it looks kind of interesting, kind of distinctive, and makes the front look a little bit more unusual and visually appealing. Now, right below the elevated hexagons, you can see there are a few sensors down here, and you can see in this particular car, only one of these sensors is active, the one over on the left. The other two are dummies, they're blanks for various radar, laser, night vision functions. This car isn't equipped with all of those features, so you can see only one of those sensors is active. So, depending on which options you get in your E-Tron, you might have a few blank sensors up in front, and it won't quite look symmetrical when you look at it dead on from the front. Now, speaking of the front, it's worth noting that this front compartment can be opened up. To do this, there's a little button inside the driver's door. You can see it here. You push that, and then it pops into this position. That's the only way to get into this front compartment. You have nothing on the key or anywhere else, but you press that, and then it pops open, and then you can open up the front compartment, and you reveal a little storage area in here. Not huge, nowhere near as large as the one in back, but there is a storage area in here, and it certainly adds to your car's practicality. If you run out of space in back, you have a little bit more room in front. You could certainly fit a small suitcase in here, a few other items, if you wanted to keep it in the front of your E-Tron GT. So there is storage up here. And by the way, since I'm on the outside of this car, one great quirk of Audi electric vehicles is the noises they make at low speeds. They don't want to silently sneak up on pedestrians and cause accidents, so they make little noises to let people know that they're there. Here's the noise this car makes when it's in drive at low speeds. And here's the noise this car makes in reverse at low speeds. Ah yes, those quirky EV noises. You don't hear those from your regular RS model Audi. Interestingly though, the opposite is true when you climb into this car. It seems a lot like every other RS model Audi. You can see RS is printed on the door sill in this carbon fiber panel, which looks cool. The inside the door panel looks like a fairly normal Audi or RS model. The key is just the normal Audi RS key with buttons on the front and RS on the back. The steering wheel just looks like a normal Audi RS steering wheel with the little golf ball dimples so you can grip it, and RS on the bottom. Frankly, it all just looks Audi RS-ish when you climb inside. And I think Audi knew that making this car electric would be a big change for a lot of its owners, and so they didn't want to change up everything else too much to give you a totally different experience. They wanted to make it feel like an Audi RS car, and it certainly does when you open the door. With that said, there are some distinctive differences in here from other Audi RS and just Audi models in general. One is the gear selector. You have this little switch in the center. You move it back to put the E-Tron into drive, as you can see. You push it forward to put the E-Tron into reverse, and neutral is somewhere in the middle. There is no traditional park gear in this car. Instead, you just stop and open your door, and it automatically goes into park. Now, you can engage the parking brake by pressing this little P button at the top of the gear selector area, and that will also put it in park, but you don't have to. If you just stop, open the door, the car goes into park automatically. Now, as for this button at the very top, top of everything that says P with little arrows. That is for your automated parallel parking system. You press that and it activates that system, and has nothing to do with actually moving through the gear. So there's no traditional park button in this car. Now, next to the gear selector area, you also have an unusual start-stop button, different from the other Audi RS models, but it is trimmed in red to make it seem a little performance-y. But probably the biggest surprise in this center console is this little control in the middle. This is your audio controls, and they're all integrated into this little circle, or at least the ones you'll use most frequently, and it operates in a strange manner. To change the track, you press the right or left part of this, and it's a button. You push it down. To turn on or off the stereo, obviously the power button, and then the mute button is on the bottom. The weirdest operation, though, is volume. You just slide your finger in circles around this circle, and that turns up or down the stereo volume in this car. Very strange control, but frankly, I think it's kind of cool, and it integrates all of your most used stereo controls into a very simple little area that doesn't have to take up a lot of room. Everything else, of course, is in the center screen. And speaking of the center screen, one very interesting item in here. In most new Audi models, you have a dual center screen setup. The upper screen controls most stuff. The lower screen has some other controls, like your climate controls, but it also can become like a pad where you write navigation destinations, whatever. So there are two screens in most new Audis, but not in this car. You have an upper screen similar to other Audi models, but the lower screen has been replaced by traditional climate controls. You have buttons and switches instead of a lower screen. More and more Audi models have been going to this dual screen, but they've now gone back from it in this car, which is surprising. And I asked Audi, why did you do that? They told me for simplicity and because this car is intended to be more driver focused. They didn't want too many screens to be in there, kind of taking people away from the focus on driving, since this is a performance EV. So for all of you button and switch enthusiasts who prefer those to screens, you get your wish in this car. The climate controls are traditional buttons, as you can see. Now, speaking of buttons, a couple of interesting controls in here. For one, in the center console over on the left, you have a button marked Drive Select, and this takes you through your drive modes. You have a few different options, namely Efficiency, Comfort, Dynamic, which is like sport mode, and then there's also an individual mode, which you can customize. Maybe a more interesting control in here, on the steering wheel, you have shift paddles. Even though it's an electric car, it doesn't have a transmission with gears like a normal car, but you still have paddles. The paddles actually dial in the amount of electric recuperation the car will give you as you drive around. You can use the paddles to basically shift from pure coasting like a normal car, or you can pull them a couple times and then you can get one pedal driving where it will automatically regen every time you slow down without pushing the brakes. And the minus and plus paddles can cycle between the different recuperation levels basically that this car offers. So they aren't traditional shift paddles, but they do have a function. Now, next up inside the interior, the infotainment system is very similar to what you get in other recent Audi models. Now, I don't have that long with this car, so I'm not going to go through all of the infotainment system quirks and features, but I will link other recent Audi reviews in the description below where I go into more depth in the infotainment system if you want to check those out. But the infotainment system, generally speaking, is very easy to use, very intuitive, very simple, very responsive to your touch, and I like it. It's not a huge screen, but it is a very good modern infotainment system that works about as you'd expect. Same deal with the gauge cluster screen. This car uses Audi's latest virtual cockpit system, which is a feature I absolutely love. Again, very intuitive and very configurable, allows you to dial in pretty much exactly what you want to see on the gauge cluster screen and minimize what you don't want. Right up with Mercedes-Benz, this is one of the very best gauge cluster screen technologies in the car industry. And again, I will have videos linked in the description below if you want to check it out in a little bit more detail. But suffice it to say, the screens in this car are pretty good and pretty much what you'd expect from other Audi models. With that said, one feature I do want to mention in the infotainment system is the rear spoiler, which you can raise manually with a little control in the system. You pull down on the screen and it reveals the spoiler control. You press it and the spoiler goes up, and then your car is more aggressive looking, I suppose. If you want to lower the spoiler, you can also do that manually. You just hold down this control and the spoiler goes down, and then you're back in your slipperiest mode, but you can self-adjust the spoiler if you want. And speaking of interior and exterior items, worth noting there was no sunroof in this car. I presume it's going to be available as an option, but this car does not have it. Instead, you have this full carbon fiber roof that just looks cool. Frankly, I prefer sunroofs, but a lot of people, especially in performance cars, like these carbon roofs. They generally make the car weigh a little less at the top end. A sunroof is pretty heavy, carbon fiber is lighter, and a lot of people think they look cool, so some people trade off the sunroof for this cool carbon roof, like this car has done. But otherwise, a lot of the interior items in here fairly similar to other Audi RS models. Like I mentioned, Audi RS steering wheel, golf ball dimples with RS in the bottom. You also have a lot of carbon fiber trim all throughout this interior, which looks like an Audi RS high-performance car like you would pretty much expect. And you have red stitching in a lot of places to accentuate the sporty character of this car. And you have RS seats. They say RS in them, and they're very grippy and huggy. Not excessively so. They're very comfortable, but they certainly are like a sportier, more aggressive seat to keep you in place during hard cornering, like, frankly, you would come to expect from an Audi RS car. And speaking of seats, next up we move on to the back seat, which you can see is quite bolstered as well, which is a pretty neat trick for a bench seat like you have in back, but you have bolsters on both the seat bottom and the seat back, again to emphasize this car's sporty feel, and so you can take your rear passengers out on the racetrack and they won't slide around either. Although for rear passengers it may not be tremendously comfortable for them because frankly there's not that much room in the back of this car. There is decent rear seat room, it's worth noting, and I'm surprised I have pretty good headroom back here. My head is not hitting the ceiling at about 6'3", 6'4", but my knees are pretty much right up against the front seat in a pretty normal position. So it's not a huge rear seat area back here. It is comfortable and sittable for adults, but it's not like you're going to be laying down anytime soon. I think part of the reason for that is these thick sport seats rob a little bit of knee and leg room from rear seat passengers. There is good space back here, but just not great like full-size luxury sedan space. You can get adults back here, but not like S-Class levels of comfort. Now, speaking of the rear seat, it's also worth noting there is a middle seat back here. So technically, you have 5 seats, 2 in front and 3 in back, although the middle seat is really just a technicality. You can see that the outboard rear seat bolsters actually sort of push up where the middle seat passenger would be, which would make it a little bit uncomfortable, and you have a rather large hump here in the back, so it'd be difficult for a middle passenger to sit. So the outboard seat's pretty big, but the middle seat not really reasonable. Instead, it's a little bit better as an armrest. You can put the armrest down, and as you can see, there are cup holders back here, or you can use it as an armrest to increase your comfort in the back. Now, one other rear seat item worth noting, you do have a rear seat temperature control back here. As you can see, you can use these plus/minus buttons to adjust the temperature, although that's all you can do. There's no rear seat fan speed control. You can't direct the air, and this particular model doesn't have rear heated seats, so all you can really do is adjust the temperature and then ask the front seat passengers nicely to do the rest for you. With that said, one other important convenience item to note with these rear seats is they do fold all the way down. There's a little latch on the side of the seat. You can fold it down and then you have a full trunk pass through. And of course, you can also do that on the other side as well. So the trunk, which was already pretty big, now it's even bigger. If you want to use this to like carry stuff like a pickup truck, you actually can. Even though this isn't a hatchback, you have a lot of storage space between the trunk and the folded down rear seats. There's decent cargo room in here. By the way, one neat trick in the back seats, if you look at the back of the front center console, you'll see there's no charge ports back here, which is kind of annoying for rear seat passengers. You can't charge any devices here, except there are charge ports. They're just hidden beneath the middle seat bottom part. You can see the charge ports are right here, so you just plug in your devices below the seat, which is actually a little bit more convenient than plugging them into the center console, and then you can charge your devices back here. And no ugly charge ports staring you in the face. They're hidden below the seat. That's pretty neat. And so those are the quirks and features of the Audi E-Tron GT. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the E-Tron GT RS. A lot of different names and letters, but they all mean that this is a pretty fast electric car. First impression getting in here, the materials are all very nice. Everything looks really great. I'm driving this car before I did all the quirks and features, so. All right, driving on the road here, first thing you can tell, I mean, instantly you can tell it just feels fantastic. Obviously the Taycan is great, and so I kind of knew to expect that going in because this car does share a lot with the Taycan, but the steering feel is excellent. The steering feel specifically is a little lighter than I was kind of hoping, than I generally am hoping from sporty cars. However, the handling and road feel is fantastic. There's great precision in the car, does not body roll, and feels like tremendously flat and poised. It is quite impressive. Now there are shift paddles, which I guess bring it into charge. Whoa, oh my God. Wow. instant torque, I mean instant response. I mean, the Taycan Turbo is one of the fastest feeling cars I have ever reviewed. I don't know that it actually is the fastest, but it's definitely up there. And this feels every bit as fast and every bit as insane. Yeah, it just really goes around turns well. I'm out here on Mulholland Highway, like a famous driving road. And again, the steering is a little lighter than I would want from like a true performance car. I feel like the steering at precision is a little bit better in the Taycan, but the handling is just fantastic. You're just planted on the road, and it just feels like it's pretty much capable of just about anything. Braking also feels very good, very confident. It's just an excellent feeling electric car. And you know, I love Tesla, I really do. I think that the Model 3 Performance, the Model S are great EVs, but the primary thing that those cars have going for them is acceleration. They don't have this level of like performance car handling. The Model 3 Performance has great steering feel and decent handling, but this car basically feels sports car like, which is, if you want a sporty EV, that's what you're looking for. Very quiet in here, and surprisingly, even with no engine note to kind of mask some of the road sounds that you would traditionally hear, like tire noise and that sort of thing, it still feels very quiet, exceptionally so. I gotta say though, the real impressive thing for me is being able to just sort of rocket forward. That probably looks so stupid on camera. I look like I'm just putting my head back, but I am not. It feels really, really, really like something. It is something special. Yeah, I mean, it drives really well. It drives comfortable. And one other impressive thing about it here, I mean, in addition to being good steering, good handling, it's pretty compliant. It feels reasonably comfortable on these roads. It doesn't drive like rough, like a lot of sports cars do. You know, you kind of feel some roughness. It feels great. I guess basically what I'm saying is it feels like a luxury car, and it feels like a performance car, and it also happens to be an EV, which is a really nice benefit. I mean, being able to have the EV capability, which is becoming really hot right now, especially in this high-end kind of performance car space, but be able to marry that with the performance driving and capability of the car, it's excellent. It really feels great. Boy, it really just grips and grips the road. It is really, really an excellent handling car. It really does drive like a sports car. It is impressive how capable it is at just handling curves. Definitely deserves to wear the RS brand name. As a sports car, I think it's pretty fantastic. As a sports sedan, I think this is just a great one. And it's right up there, I think, with Taycan in terms of the very best of these vehicles that I've driven. I think it's really an excellent car. And so that's the 2022 Audi E-Tron GT. This is an impressive electric car that offers amazing performance, a fantastic driving experience, and some great new technology. And frankly, it's a slightly more budget-friendly alternative to the Porsche Taycan with a lot of similarities. The best part, though, is that car enthusiasts now have another high-performance EV to choose from if they're thinking of taking the plunge to an electric car. Anyway, now it's time to give the E-Tron GT a DougScore.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the RS E-Tron GT looks great. Not quite exotic sports car work of art beautiful, but great, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Acceleration does 0 to 60 in 3.1 seconds, and it gets a 9 out of 10. Handling is sharp, not quite the sharpest four-door car I've ever driven, which is the Mercedes-AMG GT four-door, but not that far off, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Fun factor is huge between the massive acceleration, the handling, and the instant throttle bursts, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Cool factor is also high, though not quite as much as the Taycan, and it gets a 7 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 37 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. The RS E-Tron GT has a lot of great tech, but it lags a bit behind with no sunroof, no second center screen, no rear climate control. It gets an 8 out of 10. Comfort is fine for a car like this, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Quality is excellent, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Practicality is normal for a car like this, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Finally, value is okay. This is a very expensive car at over $140,000, and the 240-ish mile range isn't that high, but the performance and enjoyment is huge, and it's gorgeous. It gets a reasonable 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 34 out of 50. Added up, and the DougScore is 71 out of 100, which places it here against relevant cars. It ends up behind the Taycan, mostly because the Taycan is slightly quicker and has a higher cool factor score, though the e-tron gets a point back for value. Truthfully, both of these are fantastically fun cars, and anyone who's doubting that electric vehicles can be a thrill should drive a Taycan or an RS E-Tron GT. A few minutes behind the wheel and you'll have no doubt anymore.